Chapter 1. He saw the fog first, then the storm looming above, its dark expanse occasionally cut by flashes of light. The fog rode the storm's wake, billowing and curling like diaphanous bits of feminine clothing. In places the fog wrapped around the storm, long white fingers reaching out, then spiraling back in to cling to the dark mass. In constant motion, the storm itself spun in rotating shades of black and gray, except where the lightning pulsed, like a heart beating in its center. The white fog ebbed and flowed at times, teasing with glimpses of where the storm rode over the strangely calm sea. As his airship drew closer, the salt-tanged air also brought a hint of metal that left a bitter residue on his tongue. And a hint no more of burning wood teased his nostrils. There must be another ship out of sight, he concluded. If his calculations were correct, they were 1 to 2 days from making landfall. The sight of the sullen storm off the prow of his airship, and the oddness in the air lifted the hairs on his arms and sent his instruments into a frenzy of random readings that made a mockery of his many months of careful observations, not to mention his belief that science could provide the answers to all questions. Dr. Ernest Warren lowered his spyglass, handing it to his automaton ship handler to hold while he extracted his logbook and noted his observations. All of them, even the ones that offended his sense of logic, were recorded. His task was to observe and report, not to pass judgment on the data he did not like. Later he would attempt to find points of similarity buried within an admittedly incomplete historical record, or in the findings of colleagues. One thing his travels had taught him: the true scientist does not ignore anything, particularly he does not ignore the data that did not fit one's thesis. He extracted his pocket watch to note the time. But it was as useless to him as his instruments, the hands tracking around the face at close to twice their normal speed. Despite these unusual observations, the weatherman steamed forward with only a moderately increased instability as it rode the air currents. Below him, the waters of the Gulf of Mexico appeared mostly indifferent to the storm, as if sky and water operated separately from one another. Ernest had not believed the reports that reached him in Europe, had reluctantly turned his airship toward his native soil when the reports became too numerous for a serious weather scientist to ignore. The more lurid of the reports he put down to fear-driven mass hysteria and the remnants of superstition. But when a respected colleague such as Dr. Sebastian Masterson wrote him about the storm, Ernest felt compelled to take note. If this was what his friend had seen, Ernest could see why he was so. He paused his thoughts in search of the right descriptive, disquieted. This storm certainly had many unusual characteristics. But he reminded himself, serious scientific weather observation was a somewhat modern undertaking. In his studies, he had come across mentions of weather events that he had not personally observed, nor had they occurred in his lifetime. That he had never read of a storm such as this one did not mean it had not happened before. He had the heart and mind of a scientist, but he could concede that Mother Nature was intransigent and precocious. She would lull one into complacency with her sameness, then vary her theme rather violently and abruptly. She did not like to be ignored or taken for granted, hence the reason she was a mother and not a father. Despite this, he still believed that she didn't act without warning, even though it seemed so from their too limited knowledge. He would find the key to her secrets. All of them, so that never again. His thoughts flinched away from that storm. The past that had driven him from his quiet life as an inventor to his quest to finally and completely understand the vagaries of the weather. To defeat its irrationality and its random cruelty, or at least provide a warning when Mother Nature was about to go on the rampage so that adequate precautions could be taken. He pocketed his notebook and extended his hand for the spyglass. Once secured, directed it at the storm, tracking slowly from side to side, then up, trying to gauge its height. When he could not, he moved his attention to the gap between the storm and the surface of the water. If his eyes did not deceive him, the seas beneath the storm were as calm as those they rode upon. "Curious," he said aloud. "Yes, sir," Niles said with no inflection in his voice. He'd not been programmed for curiosity. Ernest considered the benefits and risks of a closer look. Though his instrumentation was not behaving, The weatherman itself appeared unaffected by the storm. If it was the storm causing the problems with his instruments, it could be completely unconnected, he reminded himself. Concluding too quickly closes the mind to further possibly critically important information. Never assume you know, even when you know. Words of Dr. Masterson to newly anointed weather scientist to be, Ernest recalled rather wryly, wishing Masterson were here with him now. The lightning flashes interested him, and yes, they tempted him. Early testing of his Blizzblighter 3000 had been promising, but limited by his inability to get beneath enough lightning strikes for sufficient energy collection. He'd rather hoped to encounter a moderate storm during the crossing, but how accurate would the results be in an atypical storm? This storm was bigger than what he'd looked for as well. If his device collected too much charge, could he safely discharge it when water was so highly conductive? Let's reduce altitude, Niles, Ernest said, lowering the spyglass. He was most curious about the perceived gap between storm and water. Did his eyes deceive him? The sea liked to play tricks on those who dared to cross it. Yes, sir. His automaton used the speaking tube to contact Crispin, his automatonic counterpart in the engine room. This change in altitude triggered a threat response in Winston and Fred, bringing them up on deck. Winston still wore the apron of a valet and Fred that of a cook, but those were side functions. They were both higher-functioning automatons, primarily programmed to act as research assistants and bodyguards. At the sight of their calm blank gazes, Ernest found he missed, for the first time, human companionship. Someone who could share the complicated mix of messy emotions roiling his insides. The desire to understand warred with the need to flee this unknown. One might take a vow to be a scientist first and always, but one was in the end still human. Is there a problem, Doctor? Winston inquired with unruffled calm. Ernest opened his mouth to explain, but closed it again. They did not have the programming to understand. He did not have that programming. He studied them. Are you both functioning normally? They were also instruments, even if higher functioning than a watch. Both automatons showed the slight eye movements associated with system checks. Yes, Doctor, Winston said, this echoed by Fred. Would they know? It was true that the automatons had surfaces resistant to the atmospheric changes and to electrical shocks, but it still seemed odd that they appeared fine, while his other instruments were clearly not. Is there a problem, Doctor? This time Fred asked the question, the tenor of his voice pitched just different enough from Winston's so that Ernest could tell them apart. They had been programmed to be persistent. This worked for Ernest most of the time, but today less so. He looked at Winston, then Fred. Was there curiosity in the question? Nothing showed in their eyes, but their programming had been designed to adapt and change within certain limits. He'd needed them to learn if they were going to be any help. And they had been of considerable help. They'd saved his life more than once, and they were able to store input for him, both visual and auditory, allowing him access to much more data than his senses could provide. This storm may prove to be a problem, he finally said. It is not behaving predictably. Both automatons turned to observe the storm as the airship continued its gradual descent. It does have unusual features, Winston said. Fred nodded agreement, adding, I am experiencing difficulty in processing the data. It falls outside known parameters. I am aware, Ernest said somewhat dryly. Is this what Mother Nature did to one experiencing hubris? He would not have chosen to return to the Gulf Coast, not now or ever. But it was to this coast that Masterson had asked him to come. Masterson knew his story. He would not have asked if it were not important. The invitation to lecture at the Institute of Meteorological Knowledge in New Orleans had come from Masterson, he suspected. He could not think how else they would have learned of his research. 4 years of weather research did not make him an expert by any standard of measurement. Ernest had left these shores not to satisfy the curiosity of men, but to save lives. He'd been certain that research could and would triumph over dogma and superstition. What price for all his efforts now? He frowned, considering his options. He'd set this course to avoid Galveston. His brain flinched again, hoping to make landfall at Mobile or Biloxi, then cutting across to New Orleans over land, thus avoiding the locus of his loss. But each time he'd adjusted course to fly around the storm, it had seemed as if it shifted to block his path. It was an illusion, of course. Storms lacked the ability to self-direct. For whatever reason, the storm was in his way. He studied the path beneath the storm. The fog thickened and thinned, alternatively revealing and hiding the apparently calm seas beneath. It appeared that the gap between water and storm was sufficient for the passage of the airship, though it would leave little maneuvering room for them between sea and sky if something changed unexpectedly. Was it possible that the storm truly did not interact with the ocean surface? He felt a stirring of scientific excitement, one tempered by the reports he'd perused about the storm. They were troubling and caused him to hesitate. However, the reports he'd read were from land-based encounters. He almost let himself get sidetracked into wondering how it was possible for the storm to appear and disappear in such a wide variety of locations. And why did some people vanish while others were untouched? Such reflections were fruitless and would not get him to his destination. He hated to admit it, but curiosity warred with fear, a wholly natural fear based on learned respect for the forces of nature. There was one other immutable reality: his fuel reserves. He lacked enough to make it back to Cuba. And if he attempted to fly over the storm and failed, he might not have enough left to attempt passage beneath. He gave the order, then turned to study the storm again. Would he wondered, see the specters in the storm? Or, his personal preference, would he find the proof to dispute what appeared to him to be exaggerated reports? Chapter 2. If Franklin Pinkerton had foresight, he'd have never named his daughter Prudence. He had known about the family business, however, which seemed to make it an ironic choice, something that Prudence didn't typically associate with her dad or as the big daddy of the agency. Perhaps he'd lost his sense of irony when he took over from his dad, who had died in mysterious circumstances, which might make Prudence the hopeful choice now that she thought about it. If her dad had hoped she'd be prudent, Hope must have died a painful death when Prudence exhibited early signs of the talent. According to Dr. Masterson, she had it stronger than any Pinkerton since her grandfather, the one who disappeared. At 16, Prudence had been flattered and intrigued by finding out she had the jets talent-wise. At 25, well, it was all Fat City until someone lost an arm during a botched dimensional transit. Or disappeared in mysterious circumstances. At least she'd made this scene with all her body parts intact, though the transit had been a rough one. The 1905 threads covered the bruising from her dimensional travel, though that was the only good thing about them. Prior to her introduction to the corset, she thought her brassiere was the worst item in her closet. She should be used to the corsets. She'd lost count of how many versions of 1905 she'd visited while pursuing her Master of Dimensions thesis, which she'd privately dubbed the Ernest Project. With the encouragement of Dr. Masterson, her advisor, she'd postulated the existence of fixed interdimensional iterations and had initially been excited when it appeared that Dr. Ernest Warren fit her construct. Dr. Masterson had cautioned her about the risks of focusing on a single research iteration, even while being equally excited about the research possibilities inherent in a fixed iteration. He'd been right about the risk of getting too close to Ernest. But if she hadn't had her eyeballs on him, she might have missed this aberrant version of Ernest. And the agency might have missed the storm until it was too late. If it wasn't already too late. She patted her nest. Man, the hairdo was almost as bad as the corset, and she needed to get into her bit, inside her head and out, or she'd be popping out the wrong slang at the wrong time. Ernest had the brains to figure her out. She frowned. Had her dad picked this time frame for her study, to keep her in the prudent zone? If he had, it had backfired. Both the storm and the Ernest had stirred up all kinds of excitement and worry within the agency, though the worry quickly burned down the excitement. Despite years and dimensions of study, interdimensional science was filled with lots of theory that was hard to prove or quantify. Each time someone thought they'd prove something, a dimension would pop up disproving that theory. Like an aberrant Ernest. A deviating iteration. Her father had wanted to send her brother to check him out, but Dr. Masterson pointed out rightly that Prudence knew the terrain, knew Ernest. Masterson's gaze had betrayed serious worry, she recalled, though he had still supported her getting the bit, the assignment, she reminded herself. At the time she'd thought his worry was all about the storm, but now she wasn't so sure. She realized that her hands had curled into fists. With some effort she straightened them, flexing them several times to ease the cramping. Had he suspected her lapse in protocol? She did indeed know Ernest. It was both a gift and a curse. She knew 100 variations of him, all of them persistently the boss with the jets to rock his time. Of course, he was a nerd in every dimension, either circled or snagged and about to be circled by his one true love, Ophelia. She made a gagging sound because she could. That Ophelia kept seeing the cutie beneath the nerd was amazing. Prudence wasn't sure which of them was the more predictable. She could plot their lives on a board. In ink. Until this one. She should be annoyed he was on track to disprove her thesis. But everyone was more worried about why the aberrant Ernest and the storm had appeared around the same time. Give or take some math formulas and plus or minus cross-dimensional errors. So that was the gig, or mission. Find out if the divergence had caused the storm. Or the storm had caused the divergence. Or if they were entirely unrelated. The divergence. An iteration. Terms were used to give them distance, to keep them from getting emotionally involved. To keep them from remembering that a divergence was a life-altering event, that the iteration was a human being with gray eyes and this straight nose that quivered. Don't go there, Prudence. It's not prudent. Here at the top of the Sand Island lighthouse, she could admit she'd been excited instead of annoyed. That she was intrigued by this one Ernest who had taken his rocket off-road. Curious to see for herself what was different, and not just for science and her thesis. Even without the storm, she'd have found a reason to come. She'd made tracks for Mobile, figuring he'd avoid Galveston, but when the storm blew up, she ran the numbers and decided the lighthouse offered the best chance of intercepting him. Everyone needed a lighthouse in a storm. Was it a storm or the storm? And how ironic was it that it had come between them? Not unlike the hundreds of Ophelias Ernest had fallen for again and again and again. But she was over that. She hoped. She couldn't afford to be more than curious. Not now. There was too much at stake, particularly if this was the storm. Whichever storm it might be, it was still out of her sight, though her instruments showed it out in the Gulf of Mexico, tracking slowly toward landfall just ahead of Ernest's airship. As the sun began its descent in the west, her view from the lighthouse was tranquil, even soothing, after her rough passage. The lighthouse keeper had been happy for the break, for a chance to take the wife ashore for the night, so Prudence was alone, but she still looked around before she lifted her arm. Her instrument panels were built into decorative leather banding on her sleeves, everything triggered by fingerprint recognition and a cognitive sensor on her pulse. She had to be alert and aware for anything to work. She activated the hologram that would stream the data from the drone she'd launched as soon as she arrived in Dimension. She'd collected enough data from his stopover in Cuba that she was confident it was the weatherman she could see steaming steadily forward, now on a direct collision course with the storm. He'd adjusted course twice, possibly attempting to go around the storm. Both times the storm had appeared as if it shifted to block him. It was a lot like Ophelia. She bit her lip. In her own time, she'd have had other options for plucking Ernest out of the path of the storm. Her brother would have let the storm have him. Louis was pragmatic to the tips of his boots. People get lost at sea all the time, he would have said. Letting it happen was one way to find out if Ernest and the storm were connected in some way. But Louis wasn't here. For some reason, He hadn't been able to transit into this dimension. No one had liked that, but they needed the data, so she got the go-ahead. As the one on the scene, it was her call. She felt in her gut, which she hoped was right and not biased, that giving the storm what it wanted was a bad idea. There was also the risk that removing him from play in this dimension might spawn more dimensions, giving the storm more places from which to draw energy. The truth was, none of them had ever seen a cross-dimensional storm quite like this one, so they were all winging it. What they needed, what they hoped for from her mission, was information. Data was the lifeblood of the agency. No one wanted to say it, but this time it might be the saving of the agency. Assuming her gut was right, if the storm did have designs on his person, she only had one option that might get Ernest where she needed him to be. She unlatched the door and scrambled out onto the high balcony that ran around the lighthouse. Yesterday, when she'd come out here, there had been a stiff breeze coming in from the Gulf. Now the air was still and heavy. It smelled different too, a wrongness to it that lifted the hairs on the back of her neck. The menace, sensed but not seen, set off a flight or fight response, and she had to take several deep breaths to close down the dimensional portal that tried to form in front of her. When the portal faded to a faint shimmer, she looked seaward. Could she see clouds on the distant horizon, or did she see them because she knew a storm was there? She watched the weatherman dot for a couple of seconds more. Adjusted the angle. Did it seem as if it had reduced altitude? She'd heard of ships flying over a storm, but under. She shut down the holo and switched over to communications, took a deep breath, and keyed in the code that would connect it with its counterpart on her familiar. Octavius? Baby, go fetch. She launched the pre-loaded data that would help him home in on the weatherman. Out in the waves just off the shore, the water boiled as Octavius surfaced just long enough to wave a tentacle at her. She waved back, watching the rounded dome sink out of sight, then a wake appeared, the crested V pointing straight out to sea. To Ernest. If the octopus made it past this storm. As far as they knew, the storm had shown no interest in non-humans. As far as they knew. They knew so little. She prayed for his safe passage. If she lost Octavius, she shook off the fear as a portal tried to form again. Pulled up her holo tracking. All the data they had indicated that the storm spun above both land and sea, the gap both inexplicable and puzzling. It had to touch down sometimes though, since people had disappeared in the places it had appeared. No one understood why the storm took this person, but not that one. Or why so few land grabs. Why it preferred the sea and those who sailed it. There seemed to be no pattern to where it appeared, or why it disappeared just as abruptly. Their difference engine computers had tried every combination of the data collected. Even the so-called link to this dimension, to this Ernest, was a tenuous one. The stories of what those not taken had seen, well, none of their kind could confirm or disprove the specters in the storm. Or even theorize what they could mean. Her brother had volunteered to ride out the storm when it popped up in their home dimension, but it had vanished before he could get under it. That left this dimension, with this aberrant Ernest, as their only hope. No one was certain there was a connection. Or that there wasn't. But it was the only dimension not showing stress from the storm. If this was the storm, she reminded herself. It wasn't proof positive, this storm shifting to block his path, but it was troubling. An atypical Ernest, and now an atypical storm. Was it stalking Ernest? Or worse, was his aberrant iteration the cause of the storm, as her father and others believed? You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.